Thanks be to God, but I'm thinking you're questioning about that generosity. You don't have to admit it, but it's kind of a strange parable. Strange enough that it's one of those weeks whenever my colleagues and I get on the phone saying, "Are you really going to preach that this week? What are you going to say?" Is this the week they call the Staff Parish Relations Committee and say, "Yeah, Bishop, move her along"? It's a strange parable, but one of my friends told me a strange parable from her seminary experience that made her think of this parable. So seminary is an expensive adventure. And usually while you're in seminary, as with most grad school, you're just broke all the time. And everybody's broke, so that's okay, because everybody's in it together. But at this particular seminary experience, one of the seminarians came to seminary already overly indebted. And she was kind of the talk of the seminary because she brought with her college debt, a bunch of credit card debt from too many shopping times at Nordstrom's, and a car debt for a very fancy car that sat in the Claremont parking lot every day when she came to class. And so the students weren't really feeling very sorry for her debt. Well, lo and behold, one day she came bouncing in to say, "You are not going to believe what happened this week. One of my parishioners paid off all of my debts." She just said, "You have debt so as to embarrass your ministry," which is a thing in Methodism. We actually have to answer that question when we're ordained. John Wesley would ask that, are you in debt so as to embarrass your ministry? It was a serious question in John Wesley's day in 1700s England. His father, who'd been a priest, spent much of John's childhood in debtor's prison, which was a thing in England in the 1700s. If you couldn't pay your bills, you went to prison. And so that question, we all kind of laugh about it, cross our fingers behind our back and say, "Oh no, Bishop, I am not in debt so as to embarrass my ministry." But this woman definitely was. And so a loving parishioner just said, "Hand me your credit card statements, hand me your school loan paperwork," and paid it. $50,000 paid off like that. Now, it's a group of seminarians. And my friend admitted, we didn't do so well with this parable that week. We all started grumbling. Why did she get her debt paid off? She was the one who was irresponsible. She was the one who came to seminary with debt. We're all going to leave seminary with debt. That's so not fair. Oh, it's so human, isn't it? It's so human to want to count up the cost. Who's deserving, who's not deserving? Am I more deserving? Am I less deserving? Oh, it is very hard for people of wealth, even seminarians with just a little tiny bit of wealth, to give and receive without counting. Whew. This is a challenging parable. And it's interesting that Jesus sets it amongst laborers, because my experience of day laborers is very different than this parable would indicate. In Laguna, we have a day laborer site where the men and women come and maybe they'll get a cup of coffee and some free parking, but that's the only thing they get for sure that day. And I'm pretty sure that if you came at the end of the day to get a few more workers to finish up the project and you paid them all at the end of the day, nobody would grumble. They would just all be really relieved they'd had work. But Jesus is interesting when he tells parables because he wasn't telling this parable to day laborers. He was telling it to the scribes and the Pharisees and some of the wealthy Romans who were listening, and his own disciples who had been not poverty-stricken. Matthew was a tax collector, a very wealthy part of Palestinian society in those days. This is challenging for those of us who are used to counting up what we deserve. The problem is when I start counting and then I start assuming, well, if I work 4 times as hard as somebody else, then I should get 4 times as much money, I'm almost always going to be disappointed. But let's be clear. Jesus is talking about something much bigger than just money. And I know money's really big for us Americans. But he's talking about grace, which is much bigger. Have you ever seen something good happen to somebody that you think is just awful? And you've thought, why did something good happen to them? Oh, this is where Jesus would say, can I not be generous? I am the king of all I see, Jesus says. This is God's kingdom. And God's kingdom is so mysterious that it is not about getting what we deserve. It's actually about grace. It's about gaining more than we can possibly fathom, because God's grace is so big that it is bigger than anything we could ever possibly deserve. It's inviting us to give to one another with that same sort of generosity, with more than the people we give to could possibly fathom. Grace and love and forgiveness simply given for the joy of the giving. In John's gospel, Jesus says it this way. He has this long section in John 15 where he's talking about, I give you a new commandment, just love one another. By this people will know you are my disciples. Just love one another. Just love one another so that my joy in you may be complete, and so that your joy in me may be complete. This love, this grace, this generosity to which we are called is a gift that helps us find a sense of joy that goes far beyond counting, far beyond the happiness and self-satisfaction that perhaps a big bank account or a paid-off mortgage might give us. This is a joy that reaches down to the depths of our souls. Oh, generosity like this can be so life-giving if only we can give without counting. Even if this parable offends our capitalist sensitivities, engage in this parable anyway. I'm sure it offended those Roman Jewish sensitivities of first century Palestine, where they were very careful about counting who deserved what. Your sacrifice had to be just so when you went to the temple at Yom Kippur. Jesus is saying, no. Y'all just come. The widow can give her 2 little pennies. The rich man can give his denarius. It's all the same to God. Just give without counting and receive God's grace without counting, because God's going to give it to us without counting how many sins, how many mistakes, how many good deeds. That's just not the way God works. God isn't keeping count. I know there are some preachers who would tell you that God is, but I'm here to tell you that Jesus says no. God isn't keeping count. And God yearns for us to quit keeping count. Quit keeping count against ourselves. Quit keeping count against others. I had a friend who taught me this lesson. I was serving a church in Tacoma, and he was a member of the big mega church in town. Well, in those days, it was the only television ministry in town. They did this thing called live streaming I had never heard of. I didn't even know the internet was a thing, really, except for email in those days. But this pastor did, and it was a big church. And his church rewarded him with a new leased Cadillac every year and plenty of money to buy those $1,000 suits that looked really good on television. And my friend who worked for the waste management company was talking one day about how frustrated he was with the men in his men's prayer group because they were all grousing about the pastor's luxurious lifestyle. And they were saying, Jimmy, why do you keep tithing to our church? The pastor spends too much money on himself. And Jimmy would just say, my tithe is between me and God. Pastor's expenditures are between him and God. I'm just happy because I make enough money, I can tithe. And he was one of the happiest givers I knew. Tithing out of his waste management check to the church he loved and giving his time. He worshiped there joyfully every week. He went to that men's breakfast and said prayers and tried to tell the other men, quit grousing, and taught in the kids' Sunday school programs. And he was one of the most joyous Christians I've ever known because Jimmy gave without counting of his time, of his abundance, and most of all of his love. I can't think how many hidden gifts that he gave to people when they least expected it. And that was the miracle of Jimmy and knowing him. Just when suddenly he would show up at your hospital bed or a card would come in the mail, because he was just always giving. And I could see that in him Christ's joy was complete because Jimmy gave without counting. Just the pure joy. That generosity of spirit is what God yearns for each of us, not just from each of us. Because in that generosity of spirit, we don't care at the end of the day that somebody else got their $50,000 debt paid off. We just rejoice with them. We don't care at the end of the day that the sinner who confessed on her deathbed is going to be with us in eternity. Because at the end of the day, we all want the joy of being in God's arms of love unto eternity. This generosity of spirit is ours for the taking. And whenever we live into it, indeed, our joy will be complete. Amen.